Fawzia and I first worked together again several years ago when I met her through another Fawzia Qureshi, who is the architect of this building. And she came to the institute when we were still in our shabby, shoddy Shiraz Plaza place. And she developed for us our theatre course. If we ever run a 1-month program on theatre, we have the module ready designed by Fawzia, but you'll have to make that 1 month, come here and teach it. She was also working at that time on alternative theatre here, and Afzal has been involved in a multidimensional program, and we happen to have in our film archives a lot of the street theatre done under the Al-Haq period. So she was working on that with us, for herself, but she was helping us as well. Since then we have been regularly in touch, and in a way she has been another shoulder I have cried on, different moments within the last 3 years. Last year we organized as Friends of Safdar Mir a theatre festival with India and Pakistan and a conference, and Fawzia was our keynote speaker who came from the United States for that. And again I'm delighted to have her here for this course. There's a mistake, a major one I think, that we have made in the introduction to her. I'll read it out, but and with many apologies, but also it's due to her, because maybe women don't when they succeed. They are even awkward mentioning that they have pushed the parameter. Fawzia is not an associate professor, she is now a professor. But Dr. Fawzia Afzal is professor at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and was chair and organizer on women, gender in Islamic discourse at the annual Modern Language Convention in San Diego. She is the author of two biographical entries on post-colonial studies and women of color in a feminist dictionary, plus has published numerous articles on cultural imperialism and the Indo-English novel. I would like to add, before I announce the title of her lecture, that it is a wonderful coincidence that the two people that we have here are not just theoretically involved in the issues of cultural representation, but as you heard from the Shodra, she sings, and Fawzia does too. Okay, Fawzia is a real singer, we get a bit of her too, but Fawzia is also acts, and those of you who might have seen Bari, produced by a joker, Maria, how many years ago? 10 or something, more. Fawzia played the role of 13 years ago, something that we've talked about with the students. Incidentally, for the students who have saw Jalli Tejave, we have the director and producer with us today, Matia Gohar. Fawzia will be speaking on the color of feminism, performing Heiner Muller's Medeamaterial at the New York Fringe Festival 1998. Fawzia.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to have been invited to participate in the course that is continuing for these 3 months here at the Institute of Women's Studies. And as Nigat pointed out, I'm here for a 2-week session. And I said to Nigat the other day that really being a feminist is a very difficult thing. It's not easy for me to hop on a plane and come here in the middle of my own semester and my other familiar duties, but it is something that I am very, very grateful to Nigat, especially, and others here who remember me and think of me and invite me to such momentous occasions, because for me it has been very important as somebody who did grow up and spend her formative years in Lahore and in Pakistan to have maintained this connection, especially with the women's movement and with activist women in this part of the world. I work and teach and live there. I have come to my, I just want to sort of give you a little bit of a grounding for what I'm going to talk about today, that really my coming to feminism, of course, has been in the context of the United States. As I went there as a student and I did my PhD there. And it was while undergoing my studies that, of course, I sort of started to think about these issues in a much more conscious way than before. And so I have to keep that in, sort of ever present in developing my own sense of what feminism means to me and what some of the negotiations are that I have to make within the different streams of feminism, feminist theory, feminist praxis. And of course, practicing what I do and working, as I do in the context of an imperial society, and I am part of it now. And so I'm ever aware of those kinds of complications and complexities that my own subject position, of course, entails. The US is also a highly racialized society, and so I remember, of course, first thinking, well, this is great, feminism is a way for me to sort of connect with women all over the globe, including in the context of the United States primarily, and of course realized slowly but surely that, my color, which is why I call this the color of feminism, right, and my race and so on make me different from the so-called mainstream or dominant or hegemonic strand of feminism and which is primarily coming out of a white middle-class background. And yet, of course, I have to think of myself also in connection then, in turn, to other marginalized communities in the United States who have a very different relationship to the center or the mainstream than I do, and those are, of course, women from other racial and class backgrounds than myself, such as, of course, African American women, Hispanic women, and so on. And so, when I got involved with theater there a few years ago, and that was something else I wanted to talk about, is that the excess of knowledge that Yashodhara mentioned. We sort of taught to think within certain parameters and certain disciplinary boundaries, and I was, of course, trained in the discipline of English studies, a highly imperial formation, and I realized and I decided at some point that, that I would have to break out and sort of make my own excesses known and felt. And so I turned back to sort of excavate and become, again, reacquainted with theatrical sort of forms from my part of the world. And I was, my sort of long friendship with Madhya Gaur was proved to be really wonderful and useful in that regard. And I was able to work with her and her group at that time, and then other groups like Lokra's. I see some people there. And so I'm very grateful. I want to sort of publicly acknowledge all of you here because you have really contributed to my work in a number of different sites, and sort of allowed me to negotiate my position between here and there. And there and here. And of course, I want to again, just before I sort of launch on the formal part of this talk, to really, really thank Nigat, who's done a wonderful job in making something like this a reality where so many of us can come and feel at home. It's a tremendous achievement in this part of the world, and I really would like everybody to give her a hand. Okay. The color of feminism, I just want to say this is an alternative theatre group that I've been involved with, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about the group and how I got involved, and then talk a little bit about this one particular production with which I was involved a couple of years ago. And so this is, of course, in its very form, not conforming to mainstream expectations, and we've tried to do something different here, especially involving issues of feminism. The Color of Feminism, Medeamaterial at the New York Fringe Festival, 1998. When Ibrahim Qureshi, a young South Asian theatre director whom I had met through mutual friends in New York City, asked me to join his production of Heiner Muller's Medeamaterial for the second annual New York International Fringe Festival, I almost immediately said yes. The reasons for my enthusiastic response were several, the most obvious, if most superficial, being my desire to perform. Due in part to ethnicity, in part to the pressures of a demanding professional and domestic life. In other words, because I am South Asian, because I am an academic who has teaching and scholarly duties to discharge and for which I get paid, and a wife and mother of 2 young children, of course an unpaid activity, I rarely have either the opportunity or time to perform in theatrical productions unpaid or otherwise. Over the past 18 years that I have been resident in the United States, I have managed to keep up some of my musical interests, and trained in Indian classical music as a vocalist. I have evolved a partnership with jazz musicians in which we try to come up with intercultural forms of music for a variety of mixed race, multi-ethnic audiences. From the way Ibrahim described his initial ideas for the Medeamaterial production, I would get to participate in and help shape a similarly intercultural theatrical experience that would pull together my own interest in drama and music from a South Asian perspective, rooted in the diaspora, and hence by its very nature a multicultural enterprise. Furthermore, because of the fact that the play text is a quintessentially feminist one, despite both the original play and this version having been authored by Western white men, and because I was told the role of Medea would be played by several women, myself included, who were from diverse racial, ethnic, and class backgrounds, I felt I would have a practical laboratory setting to test my theoretical ideas of feminism and the women's movement in the United States. Sounds good, doesn't it? Very politically correct, in fact. Well, the reality of being involved in the rehearsal process, spread out over just under a month and followed by a one-week performance schedule, actually raised many more questions for me regarding the complicated intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality, further complicated by issues of personality and ego, of which performers have a lot of, rather than answers. I came away feeling that if cross-race, cross-cultural, cross-class friendships are to develop between women, or women and men for that matter, in order that the goals of the women's movement be fully realized, then much work still remains to be done. Being in an alternative creative space, working together as artists on the Fringe, did not mean that we all felt marginalized in the same way, or from the same structures in so-called mainstream American society. The questions that remained unresolved and unspoken, except through my interview process, through this theatrical experience, become then both the point of departure and return for my inquiry here. Who sets the terms for the discursive, or in this particular case, the performative space, which we all enter with pre-assigned labels? What happens when those labeled marginals speak up and wish to alter those terms? How did we, 3 South Asian women immigrants, 1 South Asian American first-generation 12-year-old girl, 2 white women and 1 African American woman, all presumably heterosexual, plus a gay Brazilian male dancer and a South Asian male bisexual director, perceive ourselves vis-a-vis the center-margin dichotomy played out in contemporary debates around multiculturalism and identity in the United States. In a play dominated by female energy, yet written and directed by men, how did the female actors react to each other? How, in other words, did we situate ourselves within the hierarchy of performance? And what did this reveal about our positions within the larger US society? Clearly, these questions have important ramifications for the ongoing debates within women's studies and the women's movement generally regarding the possibilities for dialogue and coalition building amongst different women in a multicultural and multi-ethnic society. These questions in turn can do and influence the possibilities for progressive change in a world comprised of both women and men. I should state at the outset that my methodology for arriving at any sort of conclusion to this set of questions was one based on the interview and hence colored by my own predilections and subjective criteria for the interview questions themselves. Being a participant observer in this enterprise should further erode any pretense of scientific objectivity, but should present in its stead, I hope, a more honest and situated analysis. What I offer, therefore, is one possible reading, my own, of an event in the realm of cultural production, which I feel sheds some light on the racial and gender politics of our times. My analysis, which takes into account both the positive and negative aspects of this experience, can also, I hope, suggest directions for future work. Let me begin with some background information about the director and the female actors, because it is the group dynamics between us that comprises the focus of this inquiry and analysis. Due to space considerations, I've chosen to focus on those testimonies that feel most pertinent to me to the issues that are under consideration here today. Ibrahim Qureshi is a South Asian male in his early mid-30s, born of Pakistani parents. Actually, he corrected me, he's in his late 20s, I'm sorry. His father was in the diplomatic service, and so Ibrahim has moved around the world since he was a child to the places where although the places where he has spent most time are Germany and Russia. He is the youngest of 3 children, the 2 older ones being female, and he describes himself as having grown up in a household of women. He claims his parents had what he calls a very complicated relationship with Pakistan, and he seems to have inherited that. He feels that because of his Pakistani background, he is fighting a cultural tradition that is anti-women because it is so heavily patriarchal. And to do the right thing, he has vowed never to marry, because to marry is to perpetuate patriarchy. Does this mean that he identifies with the cultural values of the West? Not really, because Ibrahim sees himself as not really fitting in anywhere. And he is both intellectually and personally aware of the racist and sexist traditions in Western European and North American societies as well. He feels that as a director of South Asian background who has chosen to work with Western texts, his work has been slighted by other Western directors who have seen his work in Europe and who have expressed the opinion that he doesn't really understand the material that he is working with. It was partly his resulting frustration in Europe that made Ibrahim to decide to move to New York and to try to make it in the theatre world here. But he does not want to do ethnic theatre. His politics seems to be more complicated than most identity politics debates in this country, that is to say the US, allow room for, which is to say that although he does not wish to be stuck with a South Asian label, he nevertheless wants to do theatre that makes use of South Asian culture in some way, in order then to destabilize the Western text that he is committed to working with. I don't want to do what Hanif Qureshi does, he says, in his maniacally and energetic way. In fact, he pounds the table. I'm sick of that stuff, yeah, that constant exoticizing and explaining of the primitive Eastern psyche to the Goras. No. What Ibrahim wants is to do to the West what it has done for centuries to the East, to colonize its classic texts by reinterpreting them through the eyes of the other. Hence his decision to do Medeamaterial, itself a reworking of Euripides' Medea by the German playwright Heiner Muller, to whose work Ibrahim claims he is particularly drawn because Muller himself had felt it important to address issues of racism, imperialism, and sexism in Western society. In fact, though born and raised in West Germany, Muller chose to live and work mostly in East Germany because of his anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist political beliefs. So what exactly was Ibrahim's vision for this production? The most important concept for him, as far as I could tell, was the idea of having several representations of Medea, black, white, South Asian, and to use the performance space in non-traditional ways so that the audience is constantly thrown off balance, as it were. And to help with the latter concept, he decided to invite a female visual artist of Pakistani background, now living and working in New York, Fawzia Afzal, to become a co-conceptualizer in this project. It is interesting that the concept really came together for him at a meeting that several of us South Asian women, including Fawzia, held the previous May to discuss the possibility of our working together as a group to do a multimedia performance piece for the Smithsonian, focusing on the history of women's resistance in South Asia. Fawzia, who also happens to be my cousin, had asked me to pull together a group of women artists working in different media to discuss the possibility of doing something together, which she would then propose to the Smithsonian as a program that she would like to initiate, having already been approached by their staff to come up with a project showcasing her own individual work. And that it started actually when Fawzia and I and several others discussed directions that such a project might take. And we had been having these discussions prior to this meeting where we met Ibrahim. And we had both come, Fawzia and I, to the conclusion that we would commit to a collective project only if it would help us grow politically and artistically. And in order for such growth to happen, we realized it was important for both of us to conceive of something that would allow for a dialogical space to open up between not just different South Asian women, representing a variety of national, ethnic, religious, and other groupings, but also between South Asian women and women from other minority groups within the United States, especially African American women, because of the complicated position that we brown women occupy vis-a-vis black women in a racially divided society, where black women are unarguably the most oppressed minority of all. Hence, at this first meeting, I had also invited along Imani Uzuri, an African-American woman whom I had become acquainted with several months prior when I had heard her sing at a function where I also had performed some music and poetry. Sunita Mukhi, an Indian female performance artist who has grown up in the Philippines and lived in the United States for many years and who was part of this initial group, brought Ibrahim along to our meeting because he had recently been introduced to her and was looking actively to develop connections with the South Asian artist community in New York. Clearly, what happened at this meeting resulted in our going off in a direction other than the one which we had originally gathered for. Ibrahim, excited by the prospect of working with several talented South Asian women and an African American woman, basically sold us on his concept for Medeamaterial. Since his play was already scheduled for production, we decided to devote our energies to this collective project rather than as yet nebulous Smithsonian one. Did this transference amount to a betrayal on our part of a woman-directed, woman-centered, collective, collaborational enterprise, and thus somehow lead to a weakening of our political commitment to producing a resistant female aesthetic that would challenge both Western and Eastern stereotypes and also challenge us to rethink our own identities and political affiliations in the diaspora? On several occasions during rehearsal, Imani and Sunita both confided to me that although it was a good experience to be involved with the Medeamaterial production, whatever happened to our original plan? Ananya Chatterjee, a dancer and performance artist who had been part of the original group, decided not to participate in this project at all. However, her reasons for withdrawal point to the mixed motives we all have in choosing to do what we do, because for her, working for and with Ibrahim also meant working for little or no remuneration and playing to audiences too small, she felt, to affect any lasting impression or change. Ibrahim, on his part, chose to view her refusal to work in the production as a lack of solidarity with her already beleaguered South Asian artist compadres. So then, where did our willingness to engage with the Medeamaterial production lead us in terms of our feminist proclivities? From the first time I walked onto the rehearsal stage at a small studio called Context in the East Village, I sensed tension in the air between everyone, especially between the black and the white female performers. Sheila, the white woman who was playing the textual Medea, she was actually speaking the lines in the play, seemed locked in some kind of battle for stage supremacy with Imani, who in the role of Medea living in the past had been asked to improvise vocal lyrics to the actual words of the text and was supposed to sing these simultaneously while Sheila was speaking her lines. Sunita had been given the role, created by herself, she later told me, of Creon's daughter. And she was working on creating a physical counterpoint through movement to the verbal and lyrical energies and anger being expressed through the two Medeas that I just mentioned. Sunita was being assisted by Aisha, a young Pakistani woman who was playing her nursemaid, I should say Pakistani-American woman who was playing her nursemaid and dresser. And she was basically preparing her on stage for her wedding to a black male, Jason. These women had been meeting and rehearsing under Ibrahim's direction for about 2 weeks prior to my joining them. For one thing, I'd been away in academic business, attending a theatre conference, and for another, Ibrahim felt I had a more defined role to play, breaking into the text with certain South Asian songs at strategic moments, and hence he had not felt it essential for me to be there in the initial, more exploratory stages of the rehearsals. My daughter Faryal, 12 years old at the time and with some previous stage experience of mainstream musical theatre in the US behind her, also joined the cast with me. I had told Ibrahim that I wanted her to have this experience because I felt it was important for her to be exposed to this type of alternative theatre and to be in a play about strong women. Most importantly, perhaps, I needed her to give me an alibi. My husband would not have tolerated my being away from home for the length of time it took to put this unpaid performance together, unless I could show him that I wasn't neglecting at least one of our 2 children. And I want to ask you whether this can be classified as feminist subterfuge. I have to say that the first day of rehearsal and the next were both fraught with tension and mistrust between all of us. I could tell that Imani, my friend, was not pleased with what I felt she perceived as my intrusion into the play space. Since we are both strong vocalists, it seemed inevitable that there would be some sort of clash. She felt and expressed that my singing interventions should be far more restricted than the first day when I was trying out a few ideas, whereas I definitely felt she was much too loud and her vocalizing too continuous throughout the piece, and therefore overshadowing my own brilliant contributions. Meanwhile, it became clear to all that Sheila, the white woman, was experiencing her own difficulties with Imani, which were probably now further compounded by my arrival onto the scene, although this was never articulated. The problem seemed to be the same one that I had difficulty with, that is to say, Imani's extraordinary power and presence, which felt overpowering to the rest of us. At one point during the second rehearsal I had with the group, Sheila just broke down and burst into tears of frustration, as she then articulated it, not being able to hear myself. At another point, when asked by Ibrahim to speak a little louder, she lashed out angrily, "I cannot speak any louder, ask Imani to sing less loudly." Thereafter ensued a debate, after Imani had departed, amongst the rest of us and Ibrahim, about what was to be done about the Imani problem. Clearly, we all felt and shared in some of Sheila's frustration. Beverly, a white woman and friend of Sheila's who was working as assistant manager for the production, went so far as to challenge Ibrahim's casting choice. "Why do you want to have Imani in this production? What is she adding to this piece? You should fire her." Wow. None of us had quite such an extreme reaction, but resentment against what was perceived as Imani's hijacking of the piece was felt and expressed by all. We were all feeling threatened by her to some extent, and resentful that Ibrahim seemed so enamored of her as to be incapable of really controlling her. Interestingly, Beverly and Sheila both, who barely knew me at this stage, thought that what I was doing was beautiful and that they had no difficulty at all with my presence. And I'm going to get back to the politics of that a little bit later. Now, how had it come about that we, the South Asian women, had all ganged up against the black woman and were also looking for approval for our roles from the white women? Ibrahim, at a later interview that I conducted with him after one of the early performances, confided to me that as usual the South Asian cast members gravitated towards the white presence rather than the black one. I have to say that that statement really took me aback and forced me to examine anew what had really happened here, and to test again through interviews whether Ibrahim's perception was accurate or not. My own sense is that Ibrahim's perception was correct as far as what was happening at that earlier stage went, but that as things settled down, which did not happen till we actually went into performance, and after we, the South Asian women, had obviously given the matter of stage space and mise-en-scène its aesthetic and political due, our perceptions of the entire piece changed, and with it our sympathies underwent a certain blackening. Let me explain. For example, Sunita and Aisha both, in separate interviews with me, stated that although they had not started out thinking that way, by the end of the process their thinking had become somewhat racialized. When asked to elaborate, they commented on the fact that Imani always spoke of Sheila as white, and that though they hadn't felt it at the beginning, certainly by the time we were performing, in part due to Sheila's perceived professionalism, which led her to distancing herself from the actors on and off stage, as well as through Imani's more relaxed behavior with the rest of us, as well as her own racial-like discourse, they had begun to see things a little differently. Beverly, the other white woman, through her own bad behavior, on which I'll elaborate a little bit later, had further antagonized them. So you see, that's what was happening. So the white women, black woman, and the South Asian women in the middle, but gravitating now more towards the black presence. Sunita began by stating, "Initially I was disappointed that I had not been cast as Medea, or even a Medea, and I did question Ibrahim's choice of a white woman for the textual role. However, the way that he explained it to me, I understood that we, as South Asian and black female presences, would be interrupting the white text spoken and acted by Sheila. The aim was a disruption of Eurocentric hegemony through theatrical practice. Thus, although I initially felt bad for Sheila being disrupted and disturbed by Imani's vocal interruptions, I came to see that as a necessary part of the production. Also, what happened to Sheila during the production process? Her needing, for example, to wear earplugs to shut out the noise being created not just by Imani but also by your singing.
her having to adjust to our multiple presences on stage, sharing her space, is what I think Ibrahim wanted to see happen. He wanted her to get angry, to feel discombobulated. So I do think that his approach to the mise-en-scène worked as a political strategy, but I don't think that it worked on stage. When asked why she didn't think it worked on stage, Sunita replied that she believed it was because perhaps Sheila's was what she was now beginning to call a white aesthetic, which was entirely too rigid and schooled, not allowing much room for improvisation and change. And also because her rage at the unfamiliar situation that she was in got mixed up with the rage of Medea. And she was unable to really separate the two. Interestingly, Aisha too felt that Sheila's Medea was not as successful on stage as it could have been, and she thinks that it may partly have resulted from Sheila's feeling betrayed by Ibrahim. Sheila herself admitted that she initially had no idea that Ibrahim was going to cast other women as additional Medeas. She also claims that the mise-en-scène with everything going on simultaneously in the same space was unsettling to her as a theatrical technique, and having to see herself as part of an ensemble instead of the only one required a mental and emotional readjustment of her expectations. She also claims that others not showing up on time, or sometimes not at all, for rehearsals became a terrifying ordeal for her. I think you can relate to this. Because she started to wonder what the others' commitment to the play was. Ibrahim's own disappearance, due to an earlier commitment in Russia for about 10 days in the middle of rehearsals, was equally unsettling to her. She said that this terror affected how she played her role, and she found that she had to try and devise ways to deal with what we, the other people, were doing and saying, and trying not to take our behavior as a personal betrayal. Her main problem, she feels, lay with wanting to honor the text. To her, that meant that when she, as Medea, was speaking the text, she should have been allowed to do that without the messing up and confusion that was created, in her opinion, by Ibrahim through his unusual mise-en-scène, which of course allowed Imani to recreate the text through her lyrics, which she kept singing the entire time that Sheila was speaking. Faryal and I did not cause her a similar discomfort because, in fact, what she felt when I sang some of my Sufi songs, or when Faryal ended the performance with a short Punjabi lyric, was, and I quote her, a feeling of a completely different land and space and time. I wanted more of that as a spark to my own imagination. When you would sing, I would think immediately of a sunrise over a desert. I felt called by it, and I used you for that, as a call to a different and perhaps better time and place. By contrast, Imani's contribution felt like noise to her in the final analysis. And though she says that she and Imani finally worked at things to overcome their mutual antagonism, she remained convinced to the end that Ibrahim, as director, should have used Imani's voice and talent more judiciously so that it did not feel so overwhelming. Indeed, Sheila says that during early rehearsals, when Imani would either arrive late or leave early or suddenly jump up in the middle of an interlude of improvising to go and record what she had come up with into her answering machine, probably so she could remember it for the next time, Sheila felt very upset by this behavior, which she deemed both unprofessional and controlling. Even though she says Imani's behavior may have been prompted by some fear or uncertainty of her own, to Sheila it felt like a power play, as though Imani were trying to make Sheila feel out of her depth. Hence the resentment and anger. And yet when asked if she felt the dynamics between herself and Imani and others to be fueled by racial or cultural differences, Sheila denied thinking racially. Says she, Ibrahim would point out to me that people might be doing or saying things that were racially biased and I didn't get it. Indeed, even the Medeas did not seem racially or culturally different to her because Ibrahim did not explain them to her that way. And even though she says she did see the Medeas as inhabiting different times, histories, and even cultures in the life of Medea, ultimately she saw all the Medeas as one universal woman. The fact that Jason was a black man leaving a white woman also lessened any racial spin to the play. Had he been a white man leaving a black Medea, then she might have seen it as a statement on racial issues. As it was, she saw it as a play about men leaving women and about a woman's coming to voice, expressing her rage and resentment against a patriarchal male and society in general. Beverly, who began as an assistant director to the play, quit the production a few weeks into the rehearsal, just around the time that Ibrahim got back from Russia. When I called her for an interview, she was cordial but made it clear that she quit because she found the attitudes of the director and cast less than professional. By this, what she and Sheila meant was that they were disturbed by the fact that except for Sheila, none of the rest of us seemed to be taking our commitment to the play seriously, since we were often late for rehearsals or sometimes did not show up at all. Ibrahim's going off was also perceived as a lack of professionalism, and according to Beverly, the race issue itself was a red herring. It's all about a professional attitude versus an amateur one, she said, which in turn, she said, has nothing to do with money or being paid. The two paramount issues that led to her leaving the production were that she felt theatre requires total commitment and total love, and in its absence, people should be fired. Only Sheila to her was a model of professionalism, a very talented artist, for whom this play would have been a great vehicle, except for the disturbing fact that Ibrahim was letting her work be covered over, obviously, by Imani. Why? Beverly felt strongly that if someone could not work in harmony with the rest of the cast, then the person should be let go. Okay. Meanwhile, she kept talking about her own investment in Asian theatre forms, especially kabuki and no, which she loved, and she thought we should have used those, but African American art she did not find to be very enriching. By contrasting Sheila's and Beverly's reading of the play and their perception of the roles being enacted on stage by Imani, the South Asian women, and by Sheila herself, with Sunita's and Aisha's comments, some intriguing observations regarding cross-race relations between women can be made. Another pertinent observation that needs to be made in this regard is that Beverly's dropping out of the process was linked to another event which she did not mention during her interview with me. Apparently, Beverly had become so incensed at Ibrahim's departure in the middle of the rehearsals that she had refused to hand over the wedding costume Sunita was supposed to wear in the performance, which in actuality was a very expensive wedding outfit belonging to Ibrahim's sister, saying that she had undergone too much stress due to the unprofessional nature of this enterprise and was holding the dress hostage until she was paid. Needless to say, this behavior caused further schisms between the white presence and the minority and women of color contingent. Whether or not Sheila knew of this and either aided or tried to prevent Beverly was seen as irrelevant. By now, the two of them were seen simply as representatives of the white establishment trying to exercise control and power on us colored others. Other interesting observations made by Sunita and Aisha following this debacle with Beverly and the increasing withdrawal of Sheila into a cocoon of professional meditation both prior and after the performance and rehearsals, had to do with Aisha's feeling more drawn and connected to the rest of the female cast, including Imani. And I quote Aisha, "I felt very affirmed in my sense of being a woman, surrounded as I was by so many powerful women. I do have to admit, though, that the bonding I felt did not extend to Sheila. Maybe at this point it was color, the rest of us all being varying shades of brown. The fact of the matter is that Sheila distanced herself through her incredible professionalism and her discipline, which made me admire her, but which left me no room for personal interaction with her. Whereas I hung out with Imani, Sunni, Faryal, yourself, who were more ill-disciplined and hence more familiar. Imani called Sheila's attitude whiteness, but I've met many lazy whites. So what does that mean? Maybe if real money was involved, if this were Broadway, we'd all have been like Sheila." Thus here too one gets a sense of how it is difficult to reduce a complicated network of reasoning to a one-dimensional racialized discourse. And yet it is also difficult to rule racial factors out of our thinking completely in that particular environment. Finally, Sunita expressed some interesting thoughts regarding the transformation of her own feelings about her body image. We've been discussing the body a lot recently. She went from thinking of herself as having an inappropriate body and feeling that Ibrahim did not regard her as particularly attractive, and thence not being particularly interested in her as a female stage presence, to feeling empowered and sexually attractive when she was forced to don a body-revealing costume for the performance. She claims she started getting valid strokes from everyone, including Ibrahim, but mostly from Imani and Aisha, who insisted that she start dressing more openly and sexily. So says Sunita, "I started coming to our performances dressed in miniskirts and getting a lot of compliments backstage prior to the show. Consequently, I felt great on stage, despite my initial reluctance and inhibition about revealing myself in a two-piece costume." She claims she got many compliments from various women, black, brown, and white, in the audience about her role and costume, except for one white woman who launched into a 45-minute diatribe on proper costuming and the importance of losing weight. When Sunita told her that it didn't matter to her that she had a few extra pounds on her frame, because, as she said, most women in my culture have bellies, the white woman replied, "But it's distracting." Sunita felt empowered enough at that point to ask, "But to whom is it distracting?" Several issues are worth comment here. The issue of self-esteem around body image, notions of professionalism which also have to do with issues of time, turf battles, and the whole notion of empowerment or coming to voice, which is read very differently depending upon which group of women you identify with in terms of race, ethnicity, and class. Issues of sexuality also undoubtedly got woven into this discursive framework, and in terms of this particular experience, affected the way that we as heterosexual women identified or related with the two men that we were working with, both of whom were either gay and or bisexual. Black feminist critic Barbara Christian asserts that in America, and I quote, "The enslaved African woman becomes the basis for our society's definition of our society's other." Patricia Hill Collins, another very well-known African-American critic, in her groundbreaking book Black Feminist Thought, comments on the uses of such images of othering in order to provide ideological justification for race, class, and gender oppression. She explains how even when political and economic conditions that originally generated those other controlling images disappear, such images prove remarkably resistant and tenacious because they not only keep black women oppressed, but are key in maintaining interlocking systems of race, class, and gender oppression. So the residual effect of ideology that we've also discussed these past several days. In maintaining such a system, the status of African American women as outsiders or strangers becomes the point from which other groups define their so-called normality. Thus, Ruth Shays, a black inner city resident, describes how the standpoint of a subordinate group is discredited. And I quote her, "Now to white people, your colored person is always a stranger. Not only that, we are supposed to be dumb strangers, so we can't tell them anything." Collins analyzes the effects of this othering in the following terms. As the others of society who can never really belong, strangers threaten the moral and social order. But they are simultaneously essential for its survival because those individuals who stand at the margins of society clarify its boundaries. African American women, by not belonging, emphasize the significance of belonging. Women in general, no? I would like to hypothesize that what was really being enacted on the Medeamaterial stage, both in rehearsal and during and after performance, was precisely this ritual of belonging and unbelonging. And that what caused the unease and resultant tensions amongst us all was the battle to define our own realities and establish our own identities and name our own separate histories. What started this ball rolling was the fact that the black woman amongst us, the most objectified of others, refused to play a marginal role, one that the text, as read and appropriated by white women, had assigned to her, and to us other brown women as well, to a lesser degree. In other words, she challenged a controlling image, one that was designed to keep her in her place. By insisting on doing things her way, true to her own creative impulses, by refusing to acquiesce to conventional expectations of the role, expectations upheld by Sheila and Beverly, Imani, aided by Ibrahim, a South Asian brown male, produced a certain dissonant reading of the text which initially took us all by surprise and caused a degree of discomfort, especially since it involved on all of our parts a yielding of turf. A system of oppression, claims black feminist activist Pauli Murray, draws much of its strength from the acquiescence of its victims who have accepted the dominant image of themselves and are paralyzed by a sense of helplessness. Well, Imani certainly refused this role of victim and other, and in the process liberated us all to varying degrees, of course, and certainly without doing away with our resistance altogether. From thinking of ourselves only from the point of view of performers with individual egos, to seeing our role and positioning within the drama unfolding in front of us as having a much larger socio-political significance. The process involving change in Sunita's self-image also has ramifications regarding the ways in which cross-race alliances can be built, since her experience is similar to that of many African American women in the United States. Being judged by external standards of beauty rooted in a white aesthetic can leave African American women feeling fat and ugly, especially those growing up in predominantly white middle-class neighborhoods and attending white schools. This is an assertion upheld by Wilson and Russell, the black and white women authors of another very provocative book called Divided Sisters, Bridging the Gap Between White Women and Black Women. Difference in body size is another beauty issue that can divide black and white women since, and this is a 1994 survey, things probably have changed to some degree, found that African American women weigh on the average 10 pounds more than white women of the same height. Ironically, the same survey also found that more black women than white women are satisfied with their body image, a fact that reminds us that there is a greater acceptance of large women in the African American community, possibly because in traditional African societies, full-bodied physiques were valued as symbols of health, wealth, desire, prosperity, fertility, a cultural ideal brought to America by the slaves. By contrast, the prevailing white Victorian standards of attractiveness, which have been passed down to this day in terms of body image, required the ideal woman to be delicate, with an abnormally thin waist, tightly corseted to keep its shape. Both these ideals were very much linked to issues of class, since black women brought over as slaves needed to continue to be big and strong if they were to survive the rigors of their lives, whereas the ideal white woman was really a symbol of a man's wealth. That is to say, her thinness and frailty were constant reminders of her need for masculine protection. Instead of judging themselves, and especially each other, on matters of weight, white and black women would do better to spend their energy fighting fat prejudice in general in society, conclude Wilson and Russell in their chapter on body image. Collins also advocates creating an alternative feminist aesthetic that would defy existing standards of ornamental beauty that objectify women and judge us by our physical appearance. It seems to me that Imani, though herself a tall, slender woman who defies the conventional image of the obese black woman, nevertheless tuned in very quickly to the negative self-image that Sunita had about her body and proceeded to help her challenge it. She was aided in this by Aisha, and apparently this positive reinforcement of Sunita from these two women helped the director Ibrahim also to see her in a new light. Interestingly, Sheila, like several other folks in the audience, including my South Asian husband and the white woman who said to Sunita she should lose some weight, expressed the view that they felt Sunita's body type was not suitable for the role that she was playing, that of a young virgin bride. But the question then becomes, can we, shouldn't we, challenge all such conventions so that women and men of all racial, ethnic, age and class backgrounds can feel free to play a variety of roles both on and off stage? The issue of professionalism was brought up several times in my conversations with Beverly and Sheila and others as well. And the white women, of course, felt that nobody else in the cast or crew was quite professional enough. And much of this view had to do with their perception of what constitutes professional behavior, prime amongst these factors being whether folks showed up on time for rehearsals or not. Wilson and Russell, again in Divided Sisters, write, white women are bothered by black girlfriends' tendency to be late and for failing to return phone calls promptly. Many of the white women that we interviewed also reported that African American women don't seem to think it necessary to apologize for these lapses as a white girlfriend might. Although it is risky to make generalizations of any sort about either race, it is interesting to note that the African American psychologist James Jones has posited a mode of cultural differences that may help to explain such behavior. With respect to time, he feels those of European descent have, for various reasons, a more linear and rigid relationship with the clock than those of African descent, who he claims have a more spatial and casual relationship with the fourth dimension. This difference in relating to time is reflected in the popular African American expression being on CPT, or colored people's time, as a handy excuse for tardiness in the black community. I think we can relate to this very well. Handy excuse or not, I do think tardiness about time is something rooted in culture, and as such is experienced very similarly in communities of color across the board, and thus it did become a factor linking the South Asian behavior with that of the African Americans, both of which were perceived as unprofessional and rude or disruptive by the white women, when in fact no such slights or unprofessionalism were intended. I want to now touch a little bit on the issues of class and sexuality and how they further complicated the dynamics between us, and by extension point to the many factors we must attend to when attempting to build cross-race coalitions in theory and in practice. Aisha perhaps put her finger on the real trouble spots when she said that she had a hard time seeing any racial dynamics being played out, as Imani kept insisting, and perhaps this was because she had come from an upper middle class background in Pakistan, gone straight to the elite Ivy League Harvard for an undergraduate liberal arts education, and from there to working for an investment firm on Wall Street, which employs people of all races and nationalities, a proportionate number of whom are women, this is what she's saying, and we all get along. To tell the truth, I've never felt discriminated against, and so I have a hard time really thinking about racism. She admitted to not knowing many black people and remembered that the few blacks she had encountered during her Harvard days did not talk about race, although they did pretty much hang out by themselves. And this self-segregation reinforced her feeling that people just hang out with the folks they have most in common with. And that, although it may sometimes have to do with race, it has more, in her opinion, to do with similarity of class, background, and experience. Thus, she felt that Imani's strong feelings about race and racism, her constant reference to Sheila as the white woman, her reading of Beverly's behavior in constant reference, behavior in holding Sunita's costume hostage as a white power tactic, were more expressions of Imani's class background. Her family is working class and she lives in Harlem, reinforcing her sense of racial difference. Aisha's sense of her own positioning in this discursive situation, which she felt applied more or less to all of us South Asian women, was that we were on the sidelines of the battle between Imani and Ibrahim on the one hand and Sheila and Beverly on the other. The white women liked her well enough, and she certainly got along with both, because perhaps she, Aisha, like us, was not perceived as a threat in the same way that Imani was. Was Aisha's reading of our positioning as South Asians correct? It certainly makes some sense, given that Faryal, Sunita's and my own interventions were seen as beautiful, exotic, and even appropriate by both Beverly and Sheila. Perhaps partly because we were acting in our place, and partly because things Asian hold a certain appeal for the Anglo-American imagination, like adding mango chutney to enhance the flavor of Uncle Ben's rice. If you've had Uncle Ben, you'll know that it's essential to add chutney. The difference and conflict between black and white, however, occupies an altogether other register of thought and feeling. Aisha also went on to say that she felt that I was articulating some race-related issues both during the process and afterwards in my interview sessions, which she felt had to do with the politics she herself did not yet understand or see. And perhaps in this her assessment has some validity. I do believe that Sunita, Ibrahim, and I were much more able and willing to see the hidden dynamics of racial politics being played out more than any of the others, and that it does have to do with our perception of the prevalence of racism in America, which we feel the need to combat. However, it is not simply a question of replacing one set of prevailing or controlling images with another, black, good, white, bad. Certainly, issues are much more complicated than that, and I, through this experience, was forced to examine my own latent prejudices, sort out what I thought was really going on, and figure out how best I could contribute to a more productive dialogue. How did I fare? Let me state at the outset of my conclusion now that I felt I could have done much better if I had had the courage to initiate discussions amongst all the cast members on the things that were troubling us, but which did not get articulated except in surreptitious ways that were not helpful in building any type of consensual or coalitional model. For example, when I first walked into the rehearsal space, I saw the tension, I sensed it, between Imani and Sheila. The difference in performance style was quite evident as well, and then in the middle of their cacophony, where it did appear as though each was trying to drown out the other, I had to make my contribution heard and felt. I must confess that I was overwhelmed, and knew that my primary competition would be with Imani, since she was the other vocalist and a damn good one. Since she was singing continuously, I began to wonder if I could or would be heard alongside her. This is what was going on. Jackson! Jackson! wanted Ibrahim to control Imani, the man, of course, to control her, right? Put her in her place, as it were, so that she did not end up overshadowing the rest of us. I do believe, however, that this perception of Imani and her role, as well as my own role and that of the others, changed with time and through thought and discussion with the other South Asian women and man. As some of my earlier descriptions of conversations with Sunita, Ibrahim and Aisha reveal, over time we all did come to see that Ibrahim's vision for this piece required dissonance, required that we all feel shook up and at odds with our customary expectations of a proper place and role. Thus, although I initially felt, as I think others did, that Imani was using the race argument as a convenient stick to beat the rest of us into silence, and although I have not discounted that possibility altogether even now, I think that we all came to see Imani's contribution to this piece not simply as important but essential. The fact that Beverly till the very end could not see what it was that Imani added to the piece revealed that she, and to a lesser extent Sheila, really were missing the point. Sheila, for instance, believed firmly till the end that Imani's contribution would have been much better appreciated by the audience, and that she herself would have felt much better if Imani's singing could have been limited to set points like mine was. Now, this is where I think the politics of race did play a part in helping me both to understand and accept the delimitation of my own stage role, whereas Sheila remained unable to accept the redistribution of power between white, black and brown that was indeed being represented through this piece. In other words, not just I, but Sunita and Aisha as well, came to realize both the utter necessity and the beauty of having the roles of African American, white and South Asian women on stage evolve in the way that they did. It is true that this coming around was the outcome of serious soul searching and thinking about what my or our role as South Asians generally and South Asian women specifically ought to be as people and women of color who are marginalized in a dominant Anglo-centric culture, and yet whose marginalization is differently experienced and has very different historic roots from that of African Americans generally and African American women in particular. In many ways, it has been easier for the white establishment in this country, in the US, to substitute South Asian women for black women when making their token hires in a variety of fields, including the one that I work in, which is academia. And thus, Bell Hooks, an African American scholar, feminist scholar, is not without justification when she talks about how South Asian post-colonial scholars like myself have become alibis of color for white colleagues, who do not always, the white colleagues, do not always interrogate the way in which, who do not, meaning us, post-colonial South Asian women, we do not always interrogate the way in which we enter a racialized hierarchy where, in the eyes of whites, we automatically have greater status and privilege than individuals of African descent. Mindful of this recent positioning of women like myself, which of course is related to our social class mobility, that is to say we already belong, you see, to a privileged class from our home countries, which often encourages identification with people of similar class backgrounds, who more often happen to be white rather than black, right, or Hispanic in the context of the US. And so I recognize the need to let go of my ego and work together with Imani and the others to create this challenging coalitional space on stage. Did some stage emerge after all? Like I said before, interesting things did occur and we were all shaken out of our usual way of doing things. I also believe that Sheila and Imani grew more trusting of each other as performances evolved from day to day. For instance, Sheila told me in her interview that at one point she and Imani decided to try and work things out by just taking the time to rehearse separately with each other after the first couple of performances, which had not been going very well. She claims that as they sat in a darkened room, eyes closed, really trying to listen to what the other was saying or singing, Sheila, began to see where Imani was using, and I quote, where Imani was using my energy to feed what she was doing, and I began to feel that maybe I could use a phrase she had developed to help me in my own visualization. Remarkably, we all felt the change because an overall improvement registered itself on our psyches, so that each one of us started to feel more in harmony with one another, and we took to this, with one another and with the piece, the performance piece itself. However, it is again instructive to point out the different approaches that we all took to this increased feeling of the work coming together. Whereas Sheila began to see all the Medeas as different aspects of the eternal or universal woman, We were all one, she said. I do not believe that the rest of us saw it that way. We seem to hang on to a sense of our uniqueness, our difference from each other, the only change being that we were able to live now with those differences without feeling that any one was threatening or overpowering the other. In my case, I also became increasingly comfortable about seeing my character as a contrapuntal helpmate to Imani's black Medea, and yet quite aware of the exotic appeal that I held for Sheila as well as for the black Jason. Interestingly, because both the men we were working with were gay or bisexual, the issue of sexual appeal, which functions as another wedge between white and black women, was largely avoided. The presence of South Asian women of color also triangulated the issue, and indeed, if there were any feelings of sexual competitiveness, they occurred between the South Asian contingent and the African American woman. For example, both Sunita and I felt that Ibrahim was fascinated by Imani in part because she was black and beautiful, and hence exotic and other to him in ways that we were not. Another reversal of the way things usually go, with black women for the most part feeling resentful of losing their men to white and feeling resentful of losing their men, you see, to white and brown women. This is exactly the opposite thing that happened. Jason, on the other hand, flirted outrageously with Sunita in front of Imani and the rest of us. However, neither Ibrahim's nor Jason's preference for any of the women in the cast caused any rifts between us, since we all knew they were never really interested. Also, because of the lack of overt masculinity on the part of either of these men, the play space and the performance itself came to be seen by us as a space of female energy where we had to resolve our issues as women first and foremost. Ultimately, however, the issue remains whether this experience changed our thinking about race, class, sexual and gender solidarity in any fundamental way, and equally importantly, how many of these questions and struggles were conveyed to the audience. Shazia Sikandar's experience as artist in residence for the working class African American community in Houston, Texas, it was a project called the Project Row Houses in 1996, is instructive in its contrast to what happened here. She claims that she was initially attracted to joining us in doing the Medeamaterial project with Ibrahim because of its collaborative nature, which would allow her art, or so she thought, to be translated into or to work side by side with the living, breathing artistic medium of theatre. She's a painter. In some ways, she thought this experience would be an extension of her collaborational work with the Project Row House artistic community, one where she also had the opportunity to interact with and answer questions posed to her by hundreds of visitors from the community and outside who came to see her installation over a period of 6 months. And that project was basically located in a poor, working class, black community of Houston. Thus, for example, when asked about the Eastern Muslim woman behind bars, this is one of the images that she had created as part of her installation, she felt that when she was there participating in that 6-month-long project, that she could really engage her audience with questions of representation about how images get created, who, by, and for what purposes, for she often let them know that she herself was an Eastern Muslim woman creating the other exoticized and disturbing image in front of them. Unfortunately, this aspect of community interaction and influence did not occur with the Medeamaterial production, given the nature and duration of the performance. It was an avant-garde piece presented in a Lower East Side location for just 1 week. Only a self-selected audience of a certain intellectual elite came to see the performance. Furthermore, because of a tight performance schedule, we were unable to engage with the audience in any type of conversational exchange. Thus, the opportunity to really reflect on what the piece was all about and how we as actors and director had experienced and transformed Muller's text, how we had experienced our own interracial, intercultural tensions and exchanges, none of these things were ever really discussed either between ourselves or in a dialogue with the audiences. Perhaps this is the next necessary step to help us move in the direction of true collaboration and coalition building between all of us, women and men, that is to say, real, unfettered, honest dialogue. Perhaps the next time we decide to come together to perform Medeamaterial, I'll ask everyone to read this essay and use it as a point of departure for getting all of us ready to talk and listen to each other in the hopes of improving what we do on the stage of our lives. Thank you very much.